I am drafting this petition out of a personal concern. As a horrified viewer, I witnessed AEW broadcasts involving graphic depictions of violence and murder. This statement from a petition on change.org encapsulates the outrage sparked by the recent AEW pay-per-view event, All Out. The petition highlights two particularly controversial moments. One in which Bryan Danielson was choked with a plastic bag, a scene reminiscent of real-life suffocation, and another featuring a hypodermic needle thrust into Swerve Strickland's face, followed by a brutal chair shot. The petition's author expresses alarm over the impact of such graphic content on children, stating that AEW promotes violence under the guise of real entertainment, while also contributing to harmful societal narratives about race and gender. In addition to this petition, voices of discontent have emerged from various corners. One mother expressed her dismay, stating, "I am a mother, and what I saw on Saturday night needs to stop. TBS, TNT don't give them a TV deal. What I saw was disgusting, deplorable, and I don't see how people can condone this. Please stop." Another commentator responded to the petition, echoing concerns about the potential harm AEW brings to the professional wrestling landscape, stating, "AEW has caused irreparable harm to pro wrestling by overpaying wrestlers and forcing them to injure themselves in violent horror matches." As we delve into this issue, it's essential to acknowledge my thesis. While I agree with many that AEW is not suitable for all audiences, this does not warrant a cancellation of the programming based on the events of All Out. Also, for anybody that's upset with All Elite Wrestling, making competitive pay, which could mean overpaying wrestlers, and forcing WWE and other companies to do the same, to quote Paul Heyman, "You can suck my fucking dick." That's an argument for another video, but wrestlers should be paid what they're worth. And then if there's competitive pay, with a company paying them a lot more than WWE, WWE has to do the same when they are worth nearly $10 billion. You can suck my fucking dick if you think differently. Because there's plenty of wrestlers that retire broke and homeless, or wrestlers like the one-man gang who had to stop wrestling because he couldn't afford to travel because of low pay and the expectation of paying travel expenses. To understand this perspective, one must consider the context of the feud between Adam Page and Swerve Strickland leading up to the match. Their rivalry, characterized by escalating violence and dramatic storytelling, has included intense angles such as Adam Page burning down Strickland's childhood home. Such storytelling naturally sets the stage for an extremely violent confrontation. Furthermore, AEW consistently labels its pay-per-view events as TV-14, signaling to viewers that they can expect content that pushes the boundaries of traditional wrestling. Past matches have featured blood, weapons, and other graphic elements, including their previous Texas Death Match. Given this history, it stands to reason that audiences aware of AEW's reputation and storytelling style should anticipate an intense level of violence in their matches. It is crucial to recognize that the best course of action for those who find AEW's content objectionable is simply to refrain from watching. The notion of canceling a program due to personal offense aligns with a growing culture of censorship, where differing opinions are met with demands for cancellation rather than respectful discourse. This mentality infringes upon freedom of expression and risks homogenizing entertainment to the point where it may cater only to the most sensitive viewers, thus stifling creativity and diversity in programming. In conclusion, while the violence depicted in All Out may indeed be disturbing to some, it is essential to understand the larger context of professional wrestling as a form of entertainment that often thrives on hyperbolic storytelling and exaggerated violence. Rather than seeking to erase AEW from television, perhaps the focus should be on promoting informed viewership and encouraging individuals to choose their entertainment thoughtfully. In this essay, I want to talk about why the petition is ridiculous and represents a bigger issue about cancel culture. I completely disagree with the notion that the show was misogynistic, especially regarding the Willow Nightingale and Chris Statlander match. It's baffling how some people arrive at that conclusion, considering they just had a brutal hardcore match. Maybe some folks mistook the violence for misogyny, but that's a serious misread of the situation. Let's break this down. Having two women engage in a hardcore match, complete with falls onto thumbtacks, a powerbomb through a table, and light tubes smashed over their heads, is actually a bold statement for feminism. It's saying loud and clear that women can deliver a serious ass-kicking and take one just as well as any man. Women shouldn't be watered down or held back because of their gender. Look at WWE, where they had a spring break hardcore match that featured a female wrestler using a beach ball as a weapon, or the Liv Morgan versus Rhea Ripley feud, which barely scraped the surface of what Nightingale and Statlander did. It's commendable that AEW treats women as equals, The reality is that WWE's reluctance to let women engage in such violent matches stems from the old-school taboo mindset around depicting women in brutal situations. Vince McMahon and the other leaders at the company seem to adopt a protective parent attitude, treating their female wrestlers like they're their daughters. That's the real misogyny, not allowing creative freedom and stifling violence because it's dangerous. WWE has spent years prioritizing women as models rather than wrestlers, which is why they wouldn't dare let them get scarred and bruised in a hardcore match. They'd rather have them bouncing beach balls around to maintain that polished, cute image. It's hypocritical as hell to call Nightingale and Statlander misogynistic when WWE has a history of bikini matches and bra and panty contests that, in any real-world scenario, would be seen as sexual assault. Remember that schoolgirl lingerie match featuring the fabulous Moolah, a known predator with many allegations that she sexually assaulted females, prostituted female wrestlers, and held back women's wrestling for about 30 years of the U.S.? She was literally ripping the clothes off other wrestlers and spanking their butts that were 95% bare and 5% covered by diaphanous white thongs them in front of an audience. And let's not forget the ridiculousness of Buck and Chuck, where two wrestlers acted out a homosexual relationship just to mock it at the end. Or the infamous Vince McMahon Kiss My Ass Club, where he'd force someone to kiss his ass in the ring, a clear line into sexual harassment territory. Or nowadays when people identify transgender as a sexual orientation, and then you look at how they did a segment in WWE where sexual chocolate Mark Henry is sexually assaulted by a transvestite or transsexual, because Sammy the tranny did not reveal their gender to him, perpetuating the stereotype that transvestites and transsexuals commit sexual assault by tricking straight men into thinking that they're females. And then the reaction of sexual chocolate throwing up in a toilet perpetuated the stereotype that transsexuals and transvestites are vile, disgusting, and sexually predatory. If people find this hardcore match misogynistic, then I feel the complete opposite. Two women going at it in a hardcore match is a powerful feminist statement. It says that gender doesn't fucking matter. Women can fight just as hard as men. This idea that women need to be coddled and protected because they're seen as daughters? That's bullshit. It's also a slap in the face to think they can't have hardcore matches because they need to pose for Playboy and other magazines. I can't point to a single AEW match where they sexualized women, nor can I recall one where the women involved wanted to be sexualized. So let's call it what it is. The argument that this show is misogynistic is completely ridiculous. It's time to stop being so uptight and recognize that women in wrestling can, and should, fight like hell without being pigeonholed or objectified. Before I dive deeper into this essay, I want to make it clear that I respect anyone who wants to sign this petition or voice their discontent with the show. I'm all for freedom of speech, even if I think some of these takes are downright ridiculous. It's crucial for people to express themselves, and I hope everyone gets that. I may take shots at some of the arguments out there, but I don't want anyone facing harassment. This piece is about sharing my perspective, but I also appreciate that people are stepping up to voice their opinions. As someone who grew up bottling up feelings in a household marked by emotional repression, I know the importance of speaking your mind. So, just to reiterate, whether you're anti-AEW or pro-AEW, I respect your right to use your First Amendment rights. Now let's talk about these folks calling this garbage wrestling. Yeah, that's just another way of labeling hardcore matches with a lot of shock value. Take Joey Janela, who set his foot on fire and kicked someone in an indie match. Or consider the wrestler known as Wife Beater, who used a fucking weed whacker on somebody in Combat Zone Wrestling. And who can forget New Jack, who would stab people and use a stun gun on Axl Rotten before throwing him off a scaffold onto a pile of tables. That shit is dangerous and reckless. Frontier martial arts wrestling has had matches that are downright irresponsible, like exploding barbed wire death matches and inferno matches. So yeah, putting a needle through someone's mouth is violent and controversial, and the cinder block spot? Sure, that's extreme too. But let's not pretend there hasn't been way worse and more dangerous behavior throughout the history of professional wrestling, as I've already pointed out. I'll admit, though, the needle spot was pretty unnecessary. There was no context for it. It would have made sense if Dr. Britt Baker or Adam Cole were involved. After all, she's a dentist, and he's her husband. That would have at least added a layer of believability. The cinder block, on the other hand, fits perfectly into the storytelling. Swerve has used it before, so there's continuity there. Sure, some elements of this match felt over the top and unnecessary in terms of violence, but most of it made sense given the context. This is a story about Hangman avenging Swerve's threat to his pregnant wife and kids. Hangman burning down his childhood home? Yeah, that's the kind of shit that makes you want to kill someone. The violence wasn't gratuitous, it was appropriate for the narrative. These two genuinely hate each other, and the escalation of their rivalry warranted escalating violence. While All Elite Wrestling does have a reputation for hardcore matches, this show featured 3 spots that made sense given the level of violence involved. Chris Statlander versus Willow Nightingale was totally appropriate. It was a Chicago street fight, and their feud has been simmering for over a year. Everything there was on point. Jon Moxley suffocating Bryan Danielson and putting a bag over his head, that's fitting for Moxley's character, who's all about violence. His faction's predictable introduction of Shane McMahon adds another layer of chaos. It's not just shock value, it's storytelling that makes sense. Moxley is a violent guy, so of course he'd act that way. And then there's Swerve Strickland versus Hangman Adam Page. As I've already elaborated, this match encapsulates the essence of good storytelling, even if it's violent. Characters need to act in accordance with their motivations, and aside from that needle spot, everyone behaved in a way that made sense for their characters. This isn't garbage wrestling, it's a narrative driven by raw emotion and violent vendettas. So while I can see the argument for it being excessively violent, much of it fits within the framework of storytelling. This isn't garbage wrestling, it's a well-crafted narrative that uses violence as a tool. People are out here saying this isn't professional wrestling. Sure, I get that some folks think pro wrestling is just fake combat with athletic moves and minimal hardcore bullshit. But what these protesters don't realize is that All Elite Wrestling celebrates every damn style of wrestling. You've got your regular matches, your hardcore matches that don't go completely off the rails, like MJF and his ridiculous table spots. Then you've got Ospreay's matches that are pure athleticism, inspired by Japanese wrestling, and they fucking go on for ages. AEW embraces all forms of wrestling, and that includes hardcore matches rooted in Japanese hardcore wrestling, combat zone wrestling, and frontier martial arts wrestling. This argument is about recognizing that this style of wrestling has been kicking around for ages. Let's not forget that Ric Flair, who's often hailed as the greatest wrestler ever, had his fair share of bloody brawls in the 80s, but people still think he's the shit. Or look at Kurt Angle. He had that hardcore match with Shane McMahon, where he tossed him through a wall of glass, and Shane ended up with a concussion. And you know what? People still see Kurt as a great wrestler despite that match. It certainly wasn't labeled as garbage wrestling. So yeah, calling it all not wrestling or garbage wrestling or just shock value is a serious lack of context, and it's downright hypocritical. Take that famous TLC match in WWE between the Hardy Boys, the Dudleys, and Edge and Christian. A lot of people raved about that match, but you had a bunch of assholes saying it was just stuntmen falling off ladders. Like that's not professional wrestling either. It's funny how people can praise one thing while trashing another. Look, everyone's got the goddamn right to call a match whatever the hell they want, whether it's great wrestling, hardcore wrestling, or garbage wrestling. But for me, this is storytelling leading into matches, and that makes it justifiable hardcore wrestling. I'll be honest though, earlier this year, I made a video essay about AEW, and I was sick and tired of the constant table spots. It felt like every fucking show had someone going through a table or some bullshit where they tossed Mark Briscoe into a flaming table, and then they'd suspend the countout rule just to have people brawling in the crowd for attention. When I see crap like that, I think it's bullshit. I still consider it wrestling, but it feels more like shock value and pandering to the crowd. Totally unnecessary. So yeah, I can agree that there are things I don't like in wrestling, and everyone has their own opinion on what counts as a wrestling match or not. But everything I saw this weekend was part of wrestling's variety, and people need to realize that wrestling encompasses a ton of different styles. Now, let's tackle this whole think of the children bullshit. It's a terrible attitude. Should we just ban all R-rated movies too? Maybe we should all sit around watching Arthur and Barney if we want to turn into a society that thinks only about kids. People need to understand that adult entertainment exists for a reason. Not everything is meant for kids, and companies shouldn't just pander to a child audience. I remember as a kid walking in on my parents watching an R-rated movie with a naked girl crying and using profanity because she was going through some serious shit. My dad was like, "If you walk in here, I'm going to smack the shit out of you." And that was in front of my grandmother and aunt. I got the message. You're a kid, so stay out of adult content. But adults aren't going to change the channel or stop the movie just because some kid accidentally strolls in. I remember my little brother walking in while we were watching Beavis and Butthead, and my dad scared the hell out of us into putting on cartoons for him. It's just like people saying AEW needs to be kid-friendly or think of the children. The bottom line is, if AEW wants to grow as a company, They need to pay attention to what people actually want. If that means going kid-friendly, then fine, but I don't think they give a damn about being profitable. Still, there's plenty of money in hardcore matches, and they should lean into that to make bank. But I'll admit, it's not good to live in a society where everything has to be catered to kids. That's just a dictatorship mentality, where everything has to go one way. And let's remember, this was a TV-14 pay-per-view. TV-14 is just a step below R-rated. Pay-per-view means they can push the envelope a bit. I saw a comment stating that the violence was satanic. The idea that AEW is satanic or a crime against Christ because of its use of blood, violence, and theatrical elements is frankly a bit extreme. This perspective, which seems to echo sentiments from a petition I encountered, overlooks the broader context of professional wrestling. It reminds me of when Trey Parker and Matt Stone were critiqued for South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut. Some people claimed the film was a sin against God. While I don't identify as religious, I find such accusations to be somewhat outlandish. Many critics appear to lack a foundational understanding of professional wrestling's history and the various styles it encompasses, particularly hardcore wrestling. AEW draws inspiration from many wrestling traditions that may not be familiar to a mainstream audience, primarily raised on WWE's more sanitized, PG product. This disconnection can lead to misunderstandings, especially when considering the more intense styles of wrestling that have been around for decades, such as Japanese hardcore wrestling and combat zone wrestling. It's also important to recognize that while some may react strongly to the blood and violence in wrestling, the same critics often overlook similar themes in religious narratives and art. For instance, films like The Passion of the Christ feature graphic depictions of suffering, and many religious paintings depict such imagery as well. This inconsistency in how we judge violence in different contexts raises questions about the standards we apply. Additionally, wrestling has a long history of pushing boundaries and exploring controversial themes, including sacrilegious storylines. From Vince McMahon's infamous match with God to the darker personas of wrestlers like The Undertaker, these elements have been part of wrestling's allure for years. The outrage over AEW's content, when viewed through this lens, seems less about morality and more about a misunderstanding of the genre. In closing, I respect everyone's right to express their concerns through petitions and protests. Free speech is a vital aspect of our society. However, labeling wrestling as offensive or inappropriate based on a lack of exposure to its many styles and narratives can be counterproductive. AEW's approach blends various elements of wrestling, and while it may not resonate with everyone, it reflects the diversity within the sport. It's crucial for audiences to engage with a range of wrestling styles and narratives, rather than seeking to confine the medium to a single sanitized vision. Parents also play a critical role in guiding their children's viewing choices, and should take the initiative to discuss what is appropriate, rather than expecting television to be the babysitter. Remember how Rebel, Matt Hardy's wife, turned off an all-elite wrestling pay-per-view so her child cannot continue watching after Matt Hardy was injured in a very neglectful stunt? Hopefully she had a conversation with her child about why she turned off the television, because it would be disturbing for her child to see their father be injured so carelessly. And then also it would be unethical to support a company with a bad medical approach of briefly checking his injuries and then allowing him to continue the match. And I believe he was continuing this match with a concussion. I think people need to follow her example. Most importantly, if you don't think it's appropriate for your kids, turn off the television and have a conversation with them about why that's not appropriate and why they cannot continue to watch. And then also teach them to be understanding that when they get older and they're adults, they have the right to watch whatever they want, but they should also be respectful to other people and not go on a path of canceling everything just because they don't like it. Because what would happen if the shoes were reversed and they got rid of all children's programming and there is nothing but, as the Family Guy song goes, all you see is violence in movies and sex on TV. It's good to petition and protest, but it's also important to understand that it definitely leans on the style of a small group getting their way and assuming what is best for all society through a narrow lens, which is ultimately, in my opinion, a form of totalitarianism.